For centuries, history claimed civilization began with Egypt's first pharaohs, but the Egyptians themselves left records hinting at a series of forgotten worlds, 5 lost civilizations whose rulers, gods, or men reigned for tens of thousands of years before the dynasties we know. The Palermo Stone, a slab inscribed with names from an age called the First Time, lists kings whose reigns spanned up to 23,000 years, suggesting Egypt saw itself as merely the 6th inheritor of an unimaginably old cycle. If these records are true, everything we believe about the rise of civilization may be dangerously incomplete. What did the Egyptians really inherit? In the shade of ancient temple walls, the oldest Egyptian inscriptions whisper of a world that came before the pharaohs. The term Zep Tepi, carved into limestone at Edfu and Dendera, means the first occasion, not just a myth, but the beginning of everything. In these texts, the gods themselves are not distant legends. They are rulers, architects, and judges who shaped the Nile Valley long before any human king. The walls describe a golden age when order rose from chaos on the primeval mound, a sacred island that survived a great flood. Here, the gods established the laws of nature, built the first temples, and taught the arts of civilization. Dr. Layla Saad, a leading translator of Old Kingdom wall texts, has spent decades decoding these enigmatic lines. She points out that Zep Tepi is not a single story, but a recurring theme woven through centuries of Egyptian writing. In the Edfu building texts, Zep Tepi is described as the moment when the gods came forth from the waters and founded the first city. The texts speak of a time before time, when Ra, Osiris, and Thoth walked the earth, and the followers of Horus rebuilt after a catastrophe. Even the rituals of later pharaohs, like Seti Dwars, echo these ancient beginnings. They invoke Zep Tepi to legitimize their own rule, claiming to renew the cycle that began in that distant age. The imagery is vivid and precise. Reliefs show the primeval mound rising from the floodwaters, with lotus blossoms and falcon standards marking the spot where creation first took root. Inscriptions at Kam Ambo and Dendera mention the Islands of the Blessed, places said to have survived the destruction that ended the Age of the Gods. The texts do not treat these events as pure allegory. Dates and king lists are given, sometimes stretching back more than 12,000 years before the known dynasties. The Palermo Stone, though damaged, preserves traces of these divine eras, separated by clear lines from the reigns of human kings. For Dr. Saad, the language of Zep Tepi is both poetic and deliberate. The Egyptians saw themselves as inheritors of a legacy that began in a lost world, one swept away by flood or fire. This sense of deep time, measured in cycles and renewals, shaped their entire civilization. The question that remains is whether any trace of that vanished era can be found in the physical record, or if it exists only in the layered memory of stone and symbol. A battered slab of black basalt, unearthed from the sands near Memphis in 1866, sits quietly in the Palermo Archaeological Museum. The Palermo Stone, as it's now known, holds one of the oldest surviving chronicles of Egypt's kingship. Its surface, etched with rows of hieroglyphs, preserves not only the deeds of early pharaohs, but something far stranger, a record of rulers who, according to the stone, reigned long before Egypt's first dynasty. Professor Marco Rinaldi, a leading authority on Egyptian annals, has spent years tracing the stone's journey from its dusty discovery to its place in the museum's vaults. He points to the uppermost register, where the text, though badly eroded, hints at a lineage that predates all familiar history. The earliest names are not those of men, but of beings described as gods and spirits. Some fragments mention rulers like Ptah and Ra, their reigns measured not in decades, but in centuries or even millennia. The numbers are startling. One compartment aggregates over 900 years under a single divine king, while another lists the followers of Horus as a ruling house. The details are sparse, but the intent is unmistakable. These were not mere legends to the scribes who carved them, but the opening entries in Egypt's official record. The stone's format is methodical. Each ruler is given a name, a regnal length, and a series of annual notations: Nile flood heights, festivals, temple works. Even in its most damaged sections, the stone separates these primordial reigns from the later, more familiar kings. The line between myth and history blurs, yet the annals treat both with the same bureaucratic precision. In one surviving band, the name Maat, the goddess of cosmic order, appears with what may be an implausibly long reign, though the exact figure is lost to erosion. Rinaldi notes that for the ancient Egyptians, the act of recording these names was an assertion of continuity, a bridge from a vanished world to the living present. The Palermo Stone's provenance is well documented. After its discovery in the ruins of Memphis, it passed through the hands of Italian collectors before arriving in Palermo in the 1870s. No evidence suggests tampering or revision. The damage is the result of time, not censorship. Yet the fragmentary nature of the pre-dynastic register leaves much to speculation. Epigraphers count as many as 15 partial names in the divine section, though some traditions claim up to 23. The reigns, where legible, are aggregated rather than detailed, suggesting the compilers worked from older, possibly oral traditions. The stone's style, its neat compartments and careful hieroglyphs, matches other Old Kingdom monuments, confirming its authenticity as a royal document, not a later invention. What sets the Palermo Stone apart is its insistence that the Age of the Gods was not a separate mythic realm, but the true foundation of Egyptian kingship. The annals record these rulers as fact, not fable, embedding the memory of Zep Tepi into the very bones of the state. For Rinaldi, this is the heart of the mystery. Why would Egypt's earliest historians go to such lengths to document a vanished era, unless they believed it was real? The stone stands as silent testimony to a world on the edge of memory, one whose details are lost, but whose shadow lingers in the records of kings. In the sanctuaries of Abydos, where incense once drifted through shadowed halls, the king lists carved in stone do not begin with men. They open with names of gods: Osiris, Horus, Thoth, presented not as distant legends, but as rulers whose reigns are measured and recorded. The lists are matter of fact. On the temple wall, the god King Ra is given a place in the royal sequence, his name following the same formula as later pharaohs. The lists do not separate the divine from the human with mythic language. Instead, they assign regnal years, sometimes centuries, to these beings. The Palermo Stone, with its careful notations, places Ptah and his successors at the head of the ledger, their reigns spanning hundreds of years before the first mortal king appears. Coronation prayers from the Old Kingdom echo this structure. When a new pharaoh took the throne, priests invoked the line of god kings, calling on their presence as witnesses and protectors. The texts speak of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, described as semi-divine beings who ruled after the age of the gods but before the age of men. Their status is ambiguous, not fully immortal, not entirely mortal, occupying a space between worlds. The term itself, Shemsu Hor, is inscribed in the same columns as the gods, reinforcing their role as real sovereigns in the chain of succession. Dr. Layla Saad, poring over these lists, notes that the Egyptians did not draw a sharp line between legend and record. To them, the gods were not abstractions. They were rulers whose deeds shaped the land, whose laws still governed the rituals of kingship. The king lists from Abydos and Saqqara do not treat these divine and semi-divine figures as allegory. Their names are cataloged, their reigns counted, their place in history affirmed. Even the term for King Nisu is used for gods in these early registers, further blurring the distinction between heaven and earth. This treatment is not limited to one temple or one era. Inscriptions from Dendera and Kam Ombo repeat the same formula, listing gods, spirits, and Shemsu Hor as legitimate rulers. The ritual language of coronation insists that every new pharaoh is a successor to these ancient beings, inheriting not just a throne, but a cosmic order established in Zep Tepi. The effect is cumulative. Over centuries, the official record builds a continuous chain from the dawn of creation to the present ruler, each link sanctified by ritual and memory. The presence of these god kings in the official lists raises an uncomfortable question for later scribes. If the divine and semi-divine rulers are treated as historical, what does it mean for the chronology of Egypt? And why, in some later records, do these figures begin to fade, their reigns compressed or omitted? The stones and papyri preserve their names, but the clarity of their status blurs as the centuries pass. For the Egyptians, the past was not a distant country. It was a living inheritance, written in the language of gods and kings alike. Dr. Nasser Hassan stands before the Turin Royal Canon, a fragile papyrus whose columns once promised the entire sweep of Egyptian history. Yet, in the sections where the oldest kings should appear, the script dissolves into silence. The papyrus is riddled with gaps, lacunae where names and regnal years vanish, replaced by torn fibers and ink that bleeds over empty space. In these voids, the story of Egypt's beginnings is not just missing, it has been carefully obscured. Recent multispectral imaging, led by Dr. Hassan and his team, reveals more than the wear of centuries. Under specialized light, the papyrus exposes patterns of over-inking and scraping in the pre-dynastic columns. Some entries are blotted out, their outlines faint beneath a second layer of ink. The imaging picks up abrupt changes in handwriting, as if multiple scribes worked to harmonize the record. In column after column, entire reigns are condensed or erased, leaving an 800-year gap between the listed god kings and the first human pharaohs. This is not the accidental loss of time, it is the deliberate editing of memory. The motives behind these erasures are not hard to trace. The Ramesside scribes who copied the canon were working in an age obsessed with continuity. Their Egypt was a land of unbroken kingship, where each pharaoh's legitimacy depended on a clear, direct line back to the gods. Any hint of chaos, lost dynasties, or cycles of destruction threatened that narrative. The gaps in the Turin canon are not random. They cluster where mythic rulers blur into mortal kings, where the old cycles of rise and collapse would have complicated the story of a single eternal Egypt. Dr. Hassan's findings challenge the official version. The imaging shows that these gaps are not just the result of decay. Over-inked sections and scraped fibers occur exactly where the chronology grows most uncertain. In some places, the papyrus reveals faint traces of names and regnal numbers beneath the later edits. The erased centuries do not disappear cleanly, they leave behind a residue, a palimpsest of lost worlds. The metrics compiled by Hassan's team suggest that up to 8 centuries of pre-dynastic history may have been compressed or omitted, creating a smooth surface over what was once a fractured past. These discoveries raise uncomfortable questions. If the official king lists were shaped by political needs, how much of Egypt's deep history has been lost to deliberate omission? The conflict between the mythic legacy of Zep Tepi and the imperial narrative of unbroken rule plays out in every missing name, every over-inked void. For Dr. Hassan, the only way forward is to seek evidence beyond the texts, traces of those lost civilizations that cannot be erased with a brush or a pen. The search for Egypt's true beginnings now moves from papyrus to stone, from written record to the ground itself. At the edge of the western desert, rows of ancient stones rise from the sand in silent formation. Nabta Playa, dating to nearly 7,000 years before the present, holds a megalithic circle aligned to the summer solstice. Charcoal samples buried beneath these stones, tested by radiocarbon labs, confirm construction between 6,800 and 6,400 BCE. The circle's precise orientation to the rising sun and the Milky Way suggests a level of astronomical awareness that predates the pyramids by millennia. Archaeologists sifted through the sediment, uncovering hearths and cattle burials set in careful patterns, signs of a society organizing itself around the heavens long before the Nile's first kings. Far to the north, the earliest tombs at Saqqara show engineering that defies simple beginnings. Mastaba I, built around 3100 BCE, stretches 40 meters in length. Its walls, aligned within a few centimeters of true north, are constructed from tens of thousands of mud bricks, each laid with an architect's precision. The tomb's star-studded ceilings and deep burial chambers reveal a sudden leap in social organization. Radiocarbon samples from the tomb's fill date its construction to the dawn of the First Dynasty, yet no gradual buildup of techniques appears in the archaeological layers beneath. At Giza, the Sphinx stares eastward, its body scarred by deep fissures. Geologists like Robert Schoch argue that the weathering patterns on its limestone flanks could only have formed under heavy rainfall, a climate last seen between 7000 and 5000 BCE. This controversial claim, supported by erosion analysis but challenged by mainstream Egyptologists, hints at an even older phase of monumental activity. Taken together, these sites challenge the notion that Egypt's civilization appeared fully formed with the first pharaohs. The evidence from stone, soil, and stars points to a legacy of knowledge and organization that predates the written record, a silent memory embedded in the land itself. In the crypts beneath Dendera, inscriptions speak of time as a wheel, not a straight line. The texts describe 9 great cycles, ages of creation and collapse, each ending in chaos, each followed by renewal. The Shemsu Hor, or followers of Horus, appear as agents of restoration, rebuilding after the flood that swept away the world of the gods. These stories are not cast as distant myth. They are written as encoded memory, a record of destruction and rebirth that shaped Egyptian identity across centuries. Dr. Maya Patel, a comparative mythologist, points to the doctrine of cycles inscribed on the temple walls. She explains how the Egyptians counted themselves as living in the 6th age, the inheritors of 5 vanished worlds. In her words, the Egyptians saw themselves not as the first, but as the last. Their civilization was the final link in a chain stretching back into darkness. The Dendera texts describe each age as distinct, yet bound by the same pattern: order rising from disorder, knowledge salvaged from the ruins of catastrophe. The belief in cycles is more than a story. It is a warning. The Egyptians performed rituals to sustain Ma'at, the cosmic balance, fearing that neglect would hasten the end of their own age. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, found in royal tombs, tells of a time when humanity was almost wiped out, saved only by intervention from the gods. In this worldview, history is fragile, always on the edge of collapse. The 6th age is our own. The question left hanging in the columns of stone is whether this cycle, too, will end, and who, if anyone, will remember. Today, ancient stones still whisper that civilization is older and more fragile than our textbooks admit. As new discoveries challenge old timelines, our own era stands as just one chapter in a cycle of rise and collapse. The Egyptians warned that forgetting past worlds invites their fate. What we choose to remember now may decide how long our own time endures. Share your thoughts in the comments below.